Hey everyone, welcome to this series on the endocrine system. My name is Fatima and I'm a third year medical student at LF1. In this video, I'll be covering the basic principles of endocrinology and we'll be seeing how these principles actually come into play in the second part of my talk, which is on the pituitary gland. So here's a table of contents that briefly summarizes everything that I'll be going through. So let's begin with the principles of endocrinology. The word hormone is derived from the Greek word hormao, meaning I excite or arouse. And for hormones to be able to do this, they need to have certain features so that they can work effectively. And these include their chemical structures, the patterns of secretion, and their concentrations. They have a wide variety of functions. For example, they're involved in the reproduction system, in development and growth, in maintaining homeostasis, and in regulation of metabolism and nutrient supply, just to name a few. Essentially, the signaling pathway can be divided into three main parts. So you have reception, transduction, and response. Reception is when the signaling molecule binds to the receptor. This brings about some conformational change in the receptor that activates a series of relay molecules. And eventually you have the protein that is activated that brings about the cellular response. And this can be, for example, changing the activity of an enzyme or altering gene expression. There are different mechanisms of cell signaling. So if the hormone acts on the same cell, it can be either endocrine or autocrine. And the difference between these two is that in endocrine, the hormone stays within the cell, whereas in autocrine, the hormone is secreted out of the cell, but it still affects the same cell. In paracrine, the hormone that's secreted acts on neighboring cells. In contrast to this, in endocrine, you have the hormone that's secreted into the general circulation, and this travels in the blood and affects the distant target cells. In neuroendocrine, you have the neurosecretory cell that secretes the hormone, and then it acts in the same way as the endocrine one. So the hormone travels in the blood and can affect different distant target cells. So hormones can be classified into three main groups. So you have peptide hormones made up of amino acids. So for example, insulin. Then you have amino acid derived hormones, which for example over here I've given tyrosine. So you can have tyrosine being derived from tyrosine or epinephrine, norepinephrine, even dopamine, for example. And then you have steroid hormones, which are all derivatives of cholesterol. So the cholesterol molecule is modified in some way, which gives rise to the steroid hormone. So how are these hormones actually regulated? How is the secretion regulated? And that is through feedback loops. So you have positive and negative feedback loops. And basically what feedback means is that some component of the loop actually has an effect, either directly or indirectly, on the endocrine gland that secreted the hormone, and this changes its secretory rate. So you can have the hormone actually having an inhibitory effect on the primary component of the pathway, or it can even have a stimulatory effect. And obviously this seems a bit crazy, so you can guess that this is much less common compared to the negative feedback, but it still plays a very important role in the body. So for hormones to act on the cell, you obviously need receptors. So for peptidic hormones, you have two types of receptors. You have the G protein coupled receptors and the enzyme receptors. For G protein coupled receptors, this coil-like structure, I want you to remember that this represents the 7 transmembrane structure of the G protein coupled receptors. So here we have the G protein coupled receptor, and this is associated with the G protein, as is in the name. So when the signaling molecule binds to the receptor, it changes its conformation of the receptor, and this activates the G protein, which is made up of 3 subunits, as you can see. So it's alpha, beta, and gamma, and it's the alpha subunit that's bound to GDP. So when it's activated, it releases this GDP and binds GTP, and it dissociates. So you have the alpha GDP subunit complex, and this goes and activates another enzyme known as adenylate cyclase, which converts ADP to cyclic AMP. This activates protein kinase A, and finally this activates even further proteins that eventually bring about the cellular response. And you can see that here you have GS, so the S stands for stimulatory. You can also have GI, which is inhibitory, so the alpha GDP complex would inhibit adenylate cyclase. And then you have GQ. So initially the mechanism is the same, but the alpha GDP complex actually goes and activates phospholipase C. This cleaves phosphatidyl inositol 4,5-biphosphate into IP3, which is inositol triphosphate, and diacylglycerol. So IP3 basically goes and stimulates release of calcium ions from the ER, And these calcium ions and diacylglycerol go and activate another enzyme known as protein kinase C. And this activates further proteins that again bring about the cellular response. And then you have receptors that are associated with some sort of enzyme activity. And over here, I've taken the example of tyrosine kinase receptors. So you have the signaling molecule that binds to the receptor, and this causes dimerization of the receptor. And this tyrosine kinase receptor has tyrosine residues which become phosphorylated, so they become activated, and these then activate further intracellular signaling proteins, and the signal is relayed this way. Steroid hormone receptors are a bit different. As you can see over here, you have the receptor, and these have different domains, and the main ones that you need to know are the DNA binding domain, which has these zinc fingers, and these ligand binding domain. So the steroid hormone, which can easily cross the cell membrane because it's hydrophobic, goes and binds to this ligand binding domain, and this brings about dimerization. And finally, these dimers goes and binds to a certain region on the DNA known as steroid response elements, which are located on the 5' end of the gene to be transcribed. And this basically acts like a transcription factor. So it stimulates transcription, then you have the formation of the mRNA, which brings about translation, and then new proteins, and eventually these proteins are responsible for bringing about the physiologic actions. So now let's talk about the pituitary gland. What is very important over here is you should know that how the anterior and posterior pituitary gland are linked to the hypothalamus. So the posterior one is part of the diencephalon, so the connection is pretty straightforward. You just have the cell body located in the hypothalamus, and the axon terminals extend down into the posterior pituitary, and so the hormone is stored in secretory vesicles known as herring bodies, and so when it's stimulated, it will just release those vesicles, and eventually it gets kind of diffused into the tissue of the posterior pituitary gland, and eventually from there it will make its way into the fenestrated capillaries and then into the systemic circulation. The anterior one is a bit more complicated. It's derived from the Rathke's pouch, as you will remember from anatomy. So the way it's connected is that you still have the cell body in the hypothalamus, but the axon terminal somewhere in the median eminence. So over here it releases its vesicles containing the hormone, and it makes its way through these into these primary capillary plexus. From here it travels down this portal system and then eventually reaches the anterior pituitary, where it influences the cells, and from there those cells will then release their own hormones, which will again make its way into the systemic circulation. So you have primary capillary plexus, vein, another capillary plexus, so you have the hypophyseal portal system. This is really important. So let's start with the posterior pituitary gland. You just have two hormones here, so you have ADH and oxytocin. ADH is released from the supraoptic nucleus and oxytocin from the paraventricular nucleus. And ADH is involved with controlling the osmolarity of extracellular fluid and how much water is being excreted into the urine. So the target cells are obviously the kidneys. So in the kidneys, so you have the distal tubules and connecting ducts of the kidneys, as well as sweat glands. In oxytocin, on the other hand, it regulates lactation and controls uterine contractions during labor. So the target cells is basically the myopithelial cells of the mammary gland and smooth muscle cells of the uterus. Here I just wanted to highlight some of the principles that we talked about. So you'll see how it's actually coming to action over here. So you have the ADH molecule that binds to the receptor, and you can see that's activating this G protein, and it's activating adenylate cyclase, so it's a GS protein. And so you have the formation of cyclic AMP, which activates protein kinase A. This stimulates these vesicles containing aquaporin 2 in their vesicular membrane to fuse with this apical membrane of the principal cells, and this allows the water to enter into the cell and then into the blood, so conserving water. Another feedback principle that we talked about, positive feedback. So this is much more rare, so that's why I wanted to talk about it. So over here you have the example of oxytocin. So when the baby pushes against the cervix, it causes the cervix to stretch. And this sends signals into the brain, and then the brain stimulates the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. And then oxytocin again causes the smooth muscle of the uterus to contract, and this again increases the stretch of the cervix. So this cycle basically continues, and it's a very good example of positive feedback in the body. Now, the anterior pituitary gland there are a bunch of hormones, and I hope this scheme kind of helps you to organize your notes. So you can see that the hypothalamus has some sort of releasing hormone always, or inhibitory hormone, and then you have the pituitary hormones. So you have the LH and FSH, which targets the reproductive system, and in the case of LH, it stimulates production of sex hormones by the gonads, whereas FSH stimulates production of sperm and eggs. Then you have the thyroid stimulating hormone, which it's in the name, so it stimulates the thyroid gland, and it causes the thyroid gland to release the thyroid hormones, and this is involved mostly in regulating metabolism. Then you have prolactin, which targets the mammary glands, and it promotes milk production. It also has some involvement in inhibiting ovulation. And then you have the growth hormone, so it targets liver, bone, muscles, and as it's in the name, growth hormone, so it stimulates growth and a higher metabolic rate. And then you have the adrenocorticotropin hormone, and this influences the adrenal glands to produce more glucocorticoids, which regulates the metabolism and also regulates the stress response. And some clinical aspects, so some disorders. So those linked with the posterior pituitary hormones is the diabetes insipidus. And in this, you have deficiency in the production of ADH. And what this causes is that you have more water being released into the urine. So you can't conserve enough water, so you have polyuria. And because of that, you have thirst. And in the case of anterior pituitary hormones, you have disorders such as Addison's disease and Cushing's disease. In the case of Addison's disease, it's a disorder in which the adrenal glands, they do not produce enough of cortisol and aldosterone. So this can be because of some autoimmune response, or it can be because of some injury to the gland itself, or infection or tumor. And so you can have some GIT problems, you can have hyperpigmentation of the skin, you can have some unintentional weight loss as well. In Cushing's disease, it's when your body produces too much cortisol. So your adrenal gland, produces too much cortisol, and this results in weight gain and fatty tissue deposits, especially in the midsection. And you have certain stretch marks as well on the skin of the abdomen, or even the thigh, for example. So here are just a few questions to make sure that you guys have been awake. The hormone that will be able to diffuse to the cell membrane by simple diffusion would be a steroid hormone, because like we've discussed, they are derived from cholesterol, so they are hydrophobic, so they can easily cross the cell membrane. Thyroid hormones are basically amines, and growth hormones are peptidic hormones, so they're hydrophilic, so they would not be able to cross through the cell membrane. The hormone that has a receptor that is a protein kinase is insulin, because insulin uses the tyrosine kinase receptor, and we've discussed that. ADH uses a G protein coupled receptor, and epinephrine uses an ion channel receptor. So yeah, that's why insulin is the correct answer. So here are the references that I used. I hope you find this video helpful, and thank you for watching.